Welcome to Pages from History. Today we're uncovering the shocking story of the Spanish Empire, from gold to nothing. Imagine controlling half the planet. Imagine ships arriving daily, loaded with more gold and silver than anyone had ever seen. Imagine being the richest, most powerful kingdom on earth. Now imagine losing it all, not through conquest, not through war, but through the very wealth that made you great. This should have been impossible. An empire drowning in gold, yet dying of poverty. What you're about to discover will change everything you thought you knew about wealth and power. Stay with us until the end. First, the Golden Dream. How Spain conquered half the world. The year was 1492. A small kingdom on the edge of Europe had just completed an extraordinary achievement. After 7 centuries of struggle, the Spanish monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella had finally united their realm. The last Muslim stronghold in Granada had fallen. The Reconquista was complete. But Spain was poor. Exhausted by centuries of war, surrounded by more powerful neighbors. No one could have predicted what would happen next. In the port of Palos, 3 small ships prepared for a journey into the unknown. Their captain was a stubborn Italian navigator named Christopher Columbus. He believed he could reach the riches of Asia by sailing west across the Atlantic Ocean. Everyone thought he was mad. The ocean was supposed to be endless, full of monsters and storms that destroyed ships. But Queen Isabella took a chance. She gave Columbus 3 vessels and a tiny crew. She had no idea this decision would transform Spain into the mightiest empire the world had ever seen. Columbus sailed into history on the 3rd of August. His ships were small and fragile. The Santa Maria, the Pinta, and the Niña, 70 men in total. They crossed an ocean that no European had deliberately traversed before. Weeks turned into months. The crew grew desperate. They threatened mutiny. They wanted to turn back. But Columbus pushed forward. Then, on the 12th of October, a lookout spotted land. Columbus believed he had reached the Indies. He was wrong. He had discovered something far more valuable. An entire new world that Europeans never knew existed. The Spanish conquistadors who followed Columbus were unlike anything the Americas had ever encountered. They were hard men forged in the brutal wars of the Reconquista, veterans who knew nothing but combat, soldiers who believed God had chosen them to spread Christianity and claim wealth. They crossed oceans in wooden ships. They marched through jungles and climbed mountains that would kill ordinary men. They were ruthless, ambitious, unstoppable. Hernán Cortés landed in Mexico in 1519 with just 600 men. Before him stood the Aztec Empire. Millions of people. Warrior societies that had never been conquered, cities larger than any in Spain, temples covered in gold, an emperor named Moctezuma who ruled from a palace that seemed like something from a dream. Cortés looked at this mighty civilization and decided to destroy it. With 600 men against millions, it should have been suicide. But Cortés had advantages the Aztecs could never anticipate. He had horses, which the natives had never seen. He had steel weapons and armor. He had guns and cannons that sounded like thunder. Most importantly, he had European diseases. Smallpox traveled ahead of the Spanish armies like an invisible destroyer. It killed millions of native people who had no immunity. Entire cities emptied as plague swept through populations. The Aztec Empire began to crumble not from Spanish swords, but from Spanish germs. Cortés also had cunning. He made alliances with tribes that hated the Aztecs. He turned the empire's enemies into his army. He held Emperor Moctezuma hostage in his own palace. He manipulated the Aztec religion, making some believe he might be a god. When the Aztecs finally fought back, Cortés and his men faced desperate battles. They fled Tenochtitlan in the middle of the night, losing hundreds of soldiers and most of their stolen gold. But Cortés didn't give up. He returned with a larger army. He besieged the great city for months. He cut off food and water. He destroyed it building by building. Can you imagine watching your civilization collapse around you, powerless to stop it? By 1521, the Aztec Empire was gone. Tenochtitlan lay in ruins. Hundreds of thousands had died. The survivors became subjects of the Spanish crown, and the gold began to flow. Temples were stripped of their treasures. Mines were discovered and exploited. Spanish ships carried wealth across the Atlantic that amazed even the conquistadors who had seized it. This was just the beginning. To the south, another conquistador named Francisco Pizarro heard tales of an even richer empire. The Inca realm stretched along the western coast of South America. It was vast and organized. Roads connected distant provinces. Agricultural terraces climbed impossible mountainsides. The Incas had engineering skills that rivaled Rome. They ruled millions from their capital in Cusco, high in the Andes Mountains. Their emperor was considered a living god. His palace walls were covered in sheets of gold. Pizarro was older than Cortés, more experienced and more brutal. In 1532, he landed in Peru with fewer than 200 men. Once again, the odds seemed impossible. But Pizarro had learned from Cortés. He knew how to exploit divisions within native empires. The Incas were weakened by a civil war between two brothers fighting for the throne. Pizarro arrived just as Emperor Atahualpa had defeated his rival. The empire was exhausted by internal conflict. Pizarro invited Atahualpa to a meeting. The emperor arrived with thousands of unarmed attendants, believing the small group of strangers posed no threat. It was a trap. Spanish cannons fired into the crowd. Cavalry charged through the plaza. In minutes, thousands of Incas were dead or fleeing. Atahualpa was captured. The emperor of the largest empire in the Americas had fallen into Spanish hands without a real battle. What happened next showed the true nature of the conquest. Atahualpa offered Pizarro a ransom that seemed like fantasy. He would fill a room with gold, once to the height of a man's reach. Then he would fill it twice more with silver. The room measured 22 feet long by 17 feet wide. The amount of precious metal would be staggering. Pizarro agreed. For months, llama trains arrived carrying golden artifacts from across the empire. Statues of gods, ceremonial vessels, decorative panels, ancient treasures of incredible artistic value. The Spanish melted it all down into bars for easier transport. They destroyed centuries of culture to create portable wealth. The ransom was paid. Pizarro killed Atahualpa anyway. The conquest of the Inca Empire was brutal even by the standards of that violent age. Spanish soldiers hunted down resistance fighters in the mountains. They enslaved indigenous people to work in silver mines under conditions that killed them by the thousands. They imposed a new religion and destroyed the old ways. They built their churches on top of Inca temples. They renamed cities and provinces. They created a new order built on exploitation and extraction of wealth. The gold and silver flowed to Spain in quantities that seemed limitless, but the greatest treasure was still being discovered. In 1545, Spanish prospectors found a mountain in what is now Bolivia, a mountain that was essentially solid silver. Cerro Rico, the rich hill. It rose above the town of Potosí like a giant pyramid. Explorers who climbed it found silver ore so pure they could extract it with simple tools. This was the greatest silver deposit anyone had ever seen. It would produce more wealth than all the Aztec and Inca treasures combined. Within decades, Potosí became one of the largest cities in the world, bigger than London or Paris. Over 160,000 people lived there, working the mines or supporting those who did. The city sprawled across the high Andes at an altitude where breathing was difficult for anyone not born there. Churches and palaces rose from the barren landscape. The wealthy lived in luxury impossible to imagine in Europe. Merchants sold goods from China and India. Theaters and gambling houses operated day and night. But beneath this glittering surface lay horror. The silver mines of Potosí consumed human lives at an appalling rate. Indigenous people were forced to work in conditions that were essentially death sentences. They descended into the mountain through narrow shafts. They worked in darkness, lit only by candles. The air was thick with dust and toxic fumes from mercury used to process the ore. Cave-ins buried workers alive. Lung diseases killed slowly over years. Many miners died within months of beginning work. Some historians estimate 8 million people perished in the mines of Potosí over the centuries of Spanish rule. 8 million lives traded for silver that would eventually prove worthless. The treasure fleet system became the lifeline of the Spanish Empire. Every year, convoys of ships gathered in American ports. They loaded silver bars, gold coins, pearls, emeralds, and exotic goods. Then they sailed across the Atlantic protected by warships. Pirates and enemy nations hunted these fleets. The loss of even one treasure ship was a disaster. The arrival of the fleet in Seville was a celebration. Crowds gathered to watch ships unload wealth beyond imagination. The Spanish crown took its royal fifth, 20% of everything. The rest enriched merchants, soldiers, and adventurers. Spain became the envy of Europe. By the middle of the 1500s, the Spanish Empire stretched around the globe. From Mexico through Central and South America, across the Caribbean islands, through the Philippines in Asia, parts of Italy and the Netherlands in Europe. Spanish ships sailed every ocean. Spanish soldiers garrisoned forts on 4 continents. The sun truly never set on Spanish territory. No empire since Rome had controlled so much of the known world. And at the heart of this empire flowed an endless river of precious metal. King Philip II ruled this vast realm from the Escorial Palace near Madrid. He worked 16 hours a day, managing an empire so large that messages took months to travel between its parts. He had more gold and silver at his disposal than any monarch in history. His armies were the best in Europe. His ships controlled the seas. He believed God had chosen Spain to lead the world into a Catholic future. He saw himself as the defender of true Christianity against Protestant heretics and Muslim infidels. He spent Spanish wealth fighting wars across Europe to achieve these goals. But what if that wealth was an illusion? The streets of Seville and Madrid filled with beggars even as silver poured into the country. Spanish nobles refused to work, considering manual labor beneath their dignity. They lived on American wealth while productive industries withered. Farmers abandoned their fields to seek fortune in the New World. Spanish ships carried silver to buy goods from other nations rather than making those goods themselves. The economy became hollow, built entirely on extraction and import rather than production, but no one noticed yet. Not while the silver kept flowing. not while Spain remained the most powerful nation on earth. The golden dreams seemed eternal, but dreams always end, and this one would end in catastrophe. Second, rivers of silver, the wealth that changed everything. The silver from Potosí arrived in Seville like a flood that never stopped. Year after year, decade after decade, ships carrying bars of precious metal that weighed tons. The amount was staggering. Between 1500 and 1600, Spanish America produced over 150,000 tons of silver. That was 80% of the world's total production, the richest silver strike in human history. It should have made Spain wealthy beyond measure forever. Instead, it destroyed the Spanish economy from within. How is that possible? Imagine you lived in Seville in 1560. Every few months, the treasure fleet arrived from America. The docks bustled with activity as workers unloaded chest after chest of silver coins. Merchants rushed to buy the precious metal. Prices started to rise. At first, it was subtle. Bread cost a little more. Rent increased slightly. But people had more silver to spend, so they didn't worry. They felt wealthy. The city expanded. New buildings rose everywhere. Markets overflowed with goods from across Europe and Asia. Life seemed better than ever. But something strange was happening beneath the surface. Spanish silver spread across Europe like water seeking its level. Merchants used it to buy French wine, Flemish cloth, Italian art, and German weapons. The silver flowed out of Spain almost as fast as it arrived. Other European nations loved this arrangement. They sold their goods to Spain and accumulated Spanish silver. They used that silver to build industries and invest in their own economies. Meanwhile, Spain produced less and less. Why work when you could buy everything with American treasure? The economic concept was simple, though no one fully understood it at the time. When you flood an economy with money, but don't increase the production of goods, prices rise. This is inflation, and Spain experienced inflation on a scale Europe had never seen before. Between 1500 and 1600, prices in Spain increased by 400%, 4 times higher. Wages couldn't keep up. Common people grew poorer even as silver piled up in the royal treasury. The kingdom was drowning in wealth but starving for actual prosperity. King Philip II faced a paradox that would have baffled the wisest economic minds. His empire brought him millions of ducats every year. The treasure fleet delivered such quantities of silver that it took days just to count it all. Yet he was constantly in debt, constantly borrowing from foreign bankers, constantly unable to pay his armies. How could this be? Where did all the money go? The answer lay in the nature of the Spanish economy and the king's ambitions. Philip believed God had called him to defend Catholic Christianity against all enemies. That meant fighting wars. Wars in the Netherlands against Protestant rebels. Wars in the Mediterranean against the Ottoman Empire. Wars in France supporting Catholic nobles. Wars in England attempting to overthrow Queen Elizabeth. Every war cost enormous amounts of money. Armies needed to be paid. Ships had to be built. Weapons and supplies required constant replacement. The costs never stopped. The Spanish infantry were the best soldiers in Europe. The famous tercios, pike and musket formations that dominated battlefields for over a century. But these professional soldiers demanded regular pay. When the silver shipments were delayed or captured by enemies, the troops mutinied. Spanish armies sometimes went months without payment. They would then loot the nearest city to compensate themselves, even cities that were supposed to be Spanish allies. The most infamous mutiny occurred in Antwerp in 1576. Spanish soldiers sacked the city for 3 days. They killed thousands of civilians. They destroyed buildings and businesses. The rampage became known as the Spanish Fury. It turned the Netherlands permanently against Spanish rule. The Dutch revolt became Philip's most expensive nightmare. The Netherlands were rich provinces, centers of trade and manufacturing. They should have been profitable parts of the empire. Instead, they became a money pit that consumed Spanish silver for 80 years. The Dutch fought with determination and intelligence. They flooded their lands to stop Spanish armies. They built fortified cities that required years to besiege. They developed powerful navies that raided Spanish shipping. Every year, Philip sent more troops and more money to the Netherlands. Every year, the revolt continued. The war cost more than all the silver coming from America. But Philip wouldn't give up. His pride wouldn't allow it. Can you imagine the frustration of the Spanish people? They owned half the world. Their ships brought home fortunes. Their soldiers won battles across Europe. Yet their kingdom grew poorer every year. Taxes increased constantly. The crown seized private shipments of silver. It borrowed from everyone willing to lend. Spanish nobles saw their wealth erode. Merchants went bankrupt. Even the church felt the financial pressure. Something was fundamentally wrong, but no one understood what. The banking houses of Europe understood perfectly. They grew rich lending money to the Spanish crown, the Fuggers of Germany, the Genoese bankers. They knew Spain would always have more silver arriving eventually, so they lent at high interest rates. They charged fees and demanded special privileges. When Spain couldn't pay, they renegotiated the loans at even higher rates. The king became trapped in a cycle of debt. He borrowed to pay for wars. The wars cost more than expected. He borrowed more to cover the shortfall. The debt grew larger. The interest payments consumed more revenue. He needed to borrow just to pay the interest on previous loans. In 1557, Philip II made a shocking announcement. Spain was bankrupt. The kingdom with the richest silver mines on earth couldn't pay its debts. The king suspended all payments to foreign creditors. He essentially defaulted on everything he owed. The financial markets of Europe panicked. Bankers who had lent to Spain lost fortunes. But what choice did they have? Stop lending to Spain? That would mean losing access to all that American silver. So they negotiated new terms. They restructured the debt. They started lending again, and Spain went right back to the same patterns. This wasn't the last bankruptcy. Spain declared bankruptcy again in 1575, and again in 1596, and again in 1607, 4 times in 50 years. Each time the king admitted he couldn't pay his debts. Each time foreign bankers took losses. Each time new loans eventually followed. It became almost routine. The richest empire on earth was also the most financially unstable. The irony would have been funny if it wasn't so tragic. The Spanish economy developed a fatal dependency on American silver. Agriculture declined because farmers could make more money in the New World or in trade. Spanish fields lay empty while the kingdom imported grain from Sicily and the Baltic. Manufacturing withered because foreign goods were cheaper and often better quality. Why build textile mills in Spain when you could buy superior cloth from the Netherlands or England? Spanish industry couldn't compete even in its own market. The empire became a giant machine that turned silver into foreign goods, enriching everyone except the Spanish themselves. The Spanish nobility made this worse with their attitudes toward work and commerce. A true Spanish gentleman didn't engage in trade or manual labor. That was beneath his honor. So the aristocracy lived off rents and government positions. They spent American silver on imported luxuries. They built grand palaces and churches. They patronized artists and writers. The Spanish golden age of art and literature flourished even as the economy crumbled. Painters like Velázquez created masterpieces. Writers like Cervantes wrote Don Quixote. But this cultural brilliance rested on economic foundations built from sand and silver. The inflation hit ordinary Spanish people hardest of all. A laborer in 1500 could buy a decent living with his wages. By 1600, those same wages bought half as much. The cost of bread, wine, meat and rent had all doubled or tripled. Meanwhile, landlords and merchants who dealt in silver grew richer. The gap between rich and poor became a chasm. Spanish cities filled with beggars, even as noble families displayed wealth beyond imagination. The social fabric began to tear. Some Spanish thinkers recognized the problem. A group of scholars called the School of Salamanca tried to understand economics in this strange new world. They studied how money worked. They developed early theories about inflation and supply and demand. They were among the first to recognize that having more money didn't automatically make a nation richer. What mattered was productive capacity, the ability to make goods people needed. Spain was losing that capacity, but their warnings went largely ignored. The silver kept coming. The king kept spending. The cycle continued. The Spanish Armada of 1588 represented both the peak of Spanish power and the beginning of its military decline. Philip II assembled the largest naval force ever seen. Over 130 ships, 30,000 men. The plan was to invade England, overthrow Queen Elizabeth, and restore Catholic rule to that Protestant nation. The Armada sailed with great ceremony and confidence. Spanish soldiers and sailors believed God would grant them victory. They were the champions of true Christianity. How could they fail? They failed catastrophically. English ships were faster and more maneuverable. English cannons had longer range. The English refused to fight the kind of close-quarters boarding battles where Spanish soldiers excelled. Instead, they sailed circles around the Spanish ships, firing broadsides and staying out of reach. Storms scattered the Armada. Ships wrecked on the coasts of Scotland and Ireland. More than 15,000 Spanish sailors and soldiers died. Less than half the fleet returned to Spain. The defeat shattered the myth of Spanish invincibility. The cost of the Armada was enormous. Not just the ships and men lost, but the money spent building and equipping the fleet. Philip had borrowed heavily to fund the expedition. When it failed, those debts remained. The disaster contributed directly to the bankruptcy of 1596. Spanish power would never fully recover. Other nations saw that the giant could be defeated. Dutch rebels fought with renewed energy. English pirates raided Spanish shipping with impunity. The empire's enemies multiplied, yet the silver still flowed from America. The mines of Potosí and Mexico produced wealth year after year. Spanish officials in the New World became fabulously rich through corruption and exploitation. They skimmed from shipments. They forced indigenous workers into slavery. They lived like kings, while the people they ruled suffered and died. The colonial system enriched a small elite while impoverishing the majority. This pattern would poison Spanish America for centuries to come. By 1600, thoughtful observers could see the empire was sick. It appeared strong from the outside, It still controlled vast territories. Its armies still fought on multiple fronts, but the internal rot was spreading. The economy was hollow. The government was drowning in debt. Social tensions were increasing. The population was declining as young men emigrated to the colonies or died in endless wars. Spain was consuming itself from within. But the collapse hadn't come yet. The treasure fleet still arrived. The silver still flowed. And everyone pretended the good times would last forever. What happened when the silver began to run out? That's when the real crisis began. Third, the Great Collapse, when gold became worthless. The 17th century dawned with Spain, still clinging to its status as a great power. But anyone paying attention could see the cracks spreading through the empire's foundations. King Philip III inherited a kingdom exhausted by his father's wars. The treasury was empty despite the silver still arriving from America. The debt had grown so large that interest payments consumed most of the government's revenue. The new king was weak and uninterested in governing. He left decisions to corrupt favorites who enriched themselves while the kingdom decayed. The golden age was ending. The age of decline had begun. The silver production from Potosí began to fall. Not dramatically at first, just a slow, steady decline that everyone tried to ignore. The richest veins had been exhausted. Miners had to dig deeper into the mountain. The ore became harder to extract and process. The indigenous labor force was dying off from overwork and disease. Fewer workers meant less silver meant less revenue meant more borrowing meant deeper debt. The cycle was accelerating toward disaster. Spanish industry had withered so completely that the kingdom couldn't even equip its own armies. Spanish soldiers fought with weapons made in Germany and Italy. They wore cloth woven in the Netherlands and England. Spanish ships were often built in foreign shipyards because Spain had lost the skills and resources to build them at home. The empire that controlled the world's silver couldn't make basic manufactured goods. This was economic suicide, played out over generations. In 1620, Spain became entangled in a war that would devastate Europe for 30 years. The 30 Years' War began as a religious conflict in Germany, Catholic versus Protestant. Spain supported the Catholic side with money and troops. At first, this seemed like another expensive but manageable commitment. Spanish generals won early victories. The Protestant cause seemed doomed. But the war grew and spread like wildfire. Sweden entered the conflict with powerful armies. France, though Catholic, supported the Protestants to weaken Spanish power. The war consumed resources on a scale that dwarfed previous conflicts. Spanish armies fought across Germany for decades. They won battles but couldn't win the war. Every campaign required more silver, more loans, more taxes wrung from an already impoverished population. The treasure fleets from America became smaller and less frequent. Pirates and enemy warships captured more shipments. The flow of silver that had seemed endless was drying to a trickle. Can you imagine the panic in Madrid as officials realized the money was running out? What do you do when your entire economy is built on a resource that's disappearing? The Spanish government tried desperate measures. They debased the coinage, mixing cheap metals with silver to make more coins. This created inflation even worse than before. Prices skyrocketed. People lost faith in Spanish money. Merchants refused to accept it. Farmers hoarded food rather than selling it for worthless coins. The economy lurched toward collapse. In 1627, Spain declared bankruptcy again. The fifth time in 70 years. Financial markets barely reacted anymore. Spanish bankruptcy had become routine. The Catalan revolt of 1640 showed how fragile Spanish unity had become. Catalonia was one of Spain's most prosperous regions, but decades of taxation to fund foreign wars had created deep resentment. When Spanish troops behaved badly in Catalan territory, the people rose in rebellion. They declared independence and sought French protection. Madrid couldn't believe it. A core Spanish province in open revolt. The government sent armies to crush the rebellion. The Catalans fought back with unexpected ferocity. The war dragged on for years, draining more resources from an already bankrupt state. At the same time, Portugal broke away from Spanish rule. The Portuguese had been unwilling members of the Spanish Empire since 1580. They saw their chance when Spain was distracted by war with Catalonia and the Netherlands. In 1640, Portuguese nobles proclaimed independence and crowned their own king. Spain tried to force them back, but lacked the strength. After decades of half-hearted war, Spain finally recognized Portuguese independence in 1668. The empire was shrinking. Piece by piece, it was falling apart. The Dutch had never stopped fighting. For 80 years, they resisted Spanish rule with determination that amazed Europe. By 1648, Spain finally accepted reality. The Treaty of Westphalia ended the 30 Years' War. As part of that peace, Spain officially recognized Dutch independence. The richest provinces of the old Spanish Netherlands were lost forever. The Netherlands had become a commercial powerhouse. Amsterdam replaced Seville as the center of European trade. Dutch ships controlled global commerce. They had colonies in Asia, Africa, and America. They prospered while Spain declined. The student had surpassed the master. French power rose as Spanish power fell. Cardinal Richelieu and then Cardinal Mazarin guided France to dominate Europe. They understood something crucial. Real wealth came from productive industries and efficient government, not from gold and silver mines. France developed manufacturing. It built strong institutions. It created a professional bureaucracy. While Spain borrowed and spent, France invested and built. By the middle of the 1600s, France had become the strongest power in Europe. Spain was becoming irrelevant. The Spanish court under Philip IV was a bizarre contrast to the kingdom's poverty. The king lived in magnificent palaces surrounded by elaborate ceremony. Court rituals governed every moment of royal life. The Spanish nobility maintained their obsession with honor and status, even as their wealth evaporated. They dressed in expensive clothes they could no longer afford. They maintained large households they couldn't pay. They sneered at commerce and industry, even as foreign merchants bought up Spanish assets at bargain prices. The disconnect between aristocratic pretension and economic reality became almost comical. King Charles II ascended the throne in 1665 as a child. He would be Spain's last Habsburg monarch. Charles was physically and mentally disabled from generations of royal inbreeding. The Spanish Habsburgs had married their cousins for so long that genetic damage was inevitable. Charles could barely speak or walk. He drooled constantly. He had seizures. He was impotent and would produce no heir. Yet this sad, sick man was the king of an empire that still stretched around the globe. The symbolism was perfect. The Spanish Empire had become as weak and deformed as its king. The silver from America had dwindled to almost nothing. Potosí still produced some ore, but the great days were over. The mountain had been gutted. What remained required enormous effort to extract. The cost of mining exceeded the value of the silver produced. Other nations had developed their own sources of precious metals or had moved beyond dependence on them entirely. The Spanish economic model was obsolete, but Spain had no other model to replace it. The kingdom didn't know how to prosper without American treasure. It never learned. Spanish armies suffered defeat after defeat. In 1659, France crushed Spanish forces at the Battle of the Dunes. This led to the humiliating Treaty of the Pyrenees. Spain ceded territory to France and admitted it was no longer the dominant power. In 1668, a Spanish army invaded Portugal and was destroyed. Spanish military reputation, built over 2 centuries, evaporated in a few decades. Other nations no longer feared Spanish soldiers. They no longer respected Spanish power. The empire that once made Europe tremble had become weak and pathetic. The Spanish economy hit bottom. Agriculture had collapsed. With no workers in the fields, famines became common. Plagues swept through malnourished populations. Spanish cities depended on foreign grain to eat. Manufacturing was almost non-existent. Spanish ports were empty, while Dutch and English ships carried global trade. The population had declined by over 2 million people in less than a century. Entire villages stood abandoned. Farmland returned to wilderness. This was worse than any military defeat. The nation itself was dying. Intellectuals and reformers tried to wake Spain from its stupor. They wrote treatises explaining what had gone wrong. They proposed reforms, develop industries, encourage immigration, reform the tax system, reduce the power of the church and nobility, end the obsession with honor that prevented productive work. But their ideas went nowhere. The social and political structures were too rigid. Too many powerful people benefited from the existing system. Change was impossible. Spain was trapped by its own history and prejudices. When Charles II died in 1700 without an heir, the question of Spanish succession plunged Europe into war. France and Austria both claimed the Spanish throne. The War of the Spanish Succession lasted 13 years. Armies fought across Europe and in the colonies. Spain itself was invaded by foreign troops. The people barely cared anymore. They were exhausted, impoverished, demoralized. Whoever won, Spain would remain weak. The empire was finished regardless of which family ruled it. The peace treaties of 1713 and 1714 ended the war and the Spanish Empire as a meaningful power. Spain lost its Italian possessions. It lost the Spanish Netherlands. It lost Gibraltar to Britain. The empire was reduced to the Iberian Peninsula and its American colonies. But even those colonies were changing. Colonial society had developed its own identity. Creoles, people of Spanish descent born in America, resented rule from Madrid. They saw clearly that Spain gave them nothing but took everything. The seeds of independence were already planted. The treasures that Spain had extracted from America over 2 centuries were gone, scattered across Europe, spent on wars that accomplished nothing, wasted on luxuries that left no legacy. The gold and silver that should have built industries and infrastructure had instead funded destruction. It had enriched foreign bankers and manufacturers. It had corrupted Spanish society and destroyed the Spanish economy. The greatest treasure in history had produced nothing but poverty and decline. How is that possible? What lesson should we learn from this catastrophe? The answer lies in understanding what real wealth is. Spain confused money with wealth. It thought that having gold and silver made it rich. But true wealth is productive capacity. The ability to make things people need and want. The skills and knowledge of your population, the efficiency of your institutions, the strength of your social fabric. Spain had none of these things. It had mountains of precious metal and nothing else. When the silver ran out, there was nothing left. The kingdom was an empty shell, decorated with the memory of gold. Other European nations learned from Spain's mistakes. They developed industries. They invested in education. They built efficient governments and strong institutions. They created banking systems that channeled capital toward productive uses. They understood that real prosperity came from making things, not from digging things out of the ground. This wisdom helped create the modern economic world, but Spain learned it too late. By the time Spanish reformers understood what needed to change, the opportunity had passed. The empire was already dead. Only the corpse remained. The indigenous peoples of America paid the highest price for Spanish greed. Millions died in the conquest. Millions more died in the mines and on plantations. Their civilizations were destroyed, their cultures suppressed, their treasures melted down and shipped away. And what did Spain do with all that wealth extracted through so much suffering? It wasted it. It threw it away on pointless wars and aristocratic vanity. The crime was made even worse by the stupidity. If Spain had used American wealth wisely, at least the suffering might have built something lasting. Instead, it built nothing. The silver flowed through Spain like water through a sieve, leaving only poverty and ruins behind. By the 1700s, Spain had become what it feared most back in 1492, a poor, weak kingdom on the edge of Europe, ignored by the great powers, unable to feed its own people, living in the shadow of its former glory. The transformation from world empire to irrelevant backwater took less than 2 centuries. That's how quickly greatness can turn to nothing when a nation loses its way, when it mistakes the symbols of wealth for wealth itself, when it fails to adapt to a changing world. The Spanish Empire rose on gold and fell on gold. The same treasure that built it also destroyed it. And that paradox contains lessons we still need to learn today. And so today we discovered that the Spanish Empire's greatest treasure became its greatest curse. An entire civilization rose to dominate half the world, only to collapse because it confused silver with real wealth. Personally, I believe this story teaches us that true prosperity comes not from what we possess, but from what we can create and build together. What do you think? Could Spain have saved itself if its leaders had made different choices? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this epic journey through history, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Pages from History. Turn on notifications for more fascinating documentaries that reveal the truth behind civilization's greatest rises and falls. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next chapter of history.